South Africa wants the governments of Malawi, Nigeria and Ethiopia to reimburse it for the cost of sending thousands of their citizens back home.
Going back home, Malawi.
According to the Department of Home Affairs, the government has spent nearly $18 million accommodating and transporting foreign nationals who either demanded to return voluntarily or were deported.
South Africa really has asked Malawi, Nigeria and Ethiopia for money. That part is true. But the story now spreading across Africa is much simpler than what South Africa actually told Parliament. Because that roughly R292 million was not described as 3 identical invoices. And the 82,175 people at the centre of this story were not all deported. Some were deported. Others left through voluntary repatriation. And once you separate those two groups, the question of who should pay becomes much more complicated. So, in this video, we're going directly to the parliamentary evidence. What did South Africa actually spend? What did it actually ask Nigeria, Malawi, and Ethiopia to reimburse? Why does Nigeria say it received nothing? And why are Nigeria and Ghana now talking about money flowing in the opposite direction? Because beneath the headline of an $18 million bill are actually several different disputes being compressed into one. Let's separate them. On 11th August, Home Affairs Director General Tommy McCode briefed Parliament on the financial consequences of South Africa's recent deportation and repatriation operation. And this is where the number comes from. Take a listen.
Implications. Chairperson, I need to indicate that this is an unfunded mandate as the Department of Home Affairs and other departments that have been involved in this matter. We have not budgeted for this. As you note that repatriations are not provided for in terms of our own legislative framework. So to date, this is what we have spent, 292 million. For these 7 items, and of course
McCode describes the operation as unbudgeted and says about R292 million had been spent. Listen carefully to the wording. He says, "This is what we have spent." That establishes the cost. It does not, by itself, establish that Nigeria received an invoice for R292 million. It does not establish that Ethiopia received one for R292 million. And it does not establish that Malawi received one for R292 million. The figure is the reported cost of the wider operation. AP likewise reported the expenditure as nearly $18 million covering transport, temporary facilities, staffing and other repatriation-related expenses. So, our first verdict is simple. Now comes the second distinction. A number that appears repeatedly in reports about this story is 82,875. But what exactly does that number represent? Home Affairs answered that directly. Take a listen.
That the Minister reflected on. So to date, by close of business on the 6th of August, we're able to process 82,875. Note, there are those that were repatriated, there are those that are coming through the deportation, and you'll note that the diagram only starts on the 30th. We do have figures from the 14th of June.
The department explicitly says the figure contains both categories. That's important, because saying South Africa deported 82,875 people would not accurately describe the evidence Home Affairs gave Parliament. AP also reported the number as people who had either been voluntarily repatriated or deported. And those are not simply two words for the same thing. Home Affairs actually explained the difference. Take a listen.
Two options that were available. One is that we'll continue to do the deportation, which is the lawful process by which we expel a non-citizen from the country informed by Section 34 of the Immigration Act. And of course, under normal circumstances, Chairperson and honorable members, the responsibility of the host country, which in this case will be South Africa, involves us doing the verification and issuing the orders to leave. On the other hand, in terms of repatriation, this is a voluntary act of returning a person to their country of origin. And of course, here we are abiding in terms of the UN Convention of 19.
That distinction changes the money question, because Mahode then says something that is easy to miss. That is one of the most important statements in this entire hearing. Home Affairs is saying that for voluntary repatriation, requesting countries ordinarily carry primary responsibility for transportation and logistics. That does not prove that Nigeria, Malawi or Ethiopia legally owe South Africa whatever amount Pretoria requests. But it does mean the argument South Africa decided to deport them, therefore South Africa must pay everything, is too simple. Because some of the movement wasn't deportation, some of it was voluntary repatriation, and Home Affairs says the normal cost expectation for that process can be different. Those questions matter before anybody can turn the R292 million total into a clean debt owed by another government. Now we reach the part that is not disputed. Pretoria did ask for reimbursement. Here is Mahode himself.
And of course, if you look at the top, this is what we had been allocated by CARA at the time. We did not anticipate the huge volumes. So CARA had allocated us 60 million. And of course, we have also written to the government of Malawi and of course the embassies of Nigeria and Ethiopia requesting reimbursements of this cost through the Department of DERCO. And we are anticipating responses from those governments.
So let's be very precise. Home Affairs told Parliament that reimbursement had been requested through diplomatic channels. But the parliamentary statement does not break that R292 million into 3 country-specific invoices. It doesn't tell us here Nigeria owes X, Malawi owes Y, Ethiopia owes Z, and that distinction becomes even more important when Nigeria responds. 3 days after the parliamentary briefing, Nigeria publicly said it had received no formal reimbursement document. Nigeria's Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Kimiebi Ebienfa, said the government had received no document to that effect. Nigeria's Consul General in South Africa also said the Nigerian mission had not received a reimbursement demand. That is a real contradiction. But it doesn't yet tell us who is responsible for it. South Africa says the communication was sent through DERCO. Nigeria says nothing has arrived. The evidence we currently have does not establish whether there was a diplomatic delay, an administrative problem, a routing issue, or something else, so we should not invent an answer. And then, the parliamentary hearing gives us another surprise, one that makes the whole idea of this being a completely unprecedented demand much harder to sustain. Later in the same meeting, MPs asked Home Affairs about the cost burden on foreign governments. Listen carefully.
And then with regards to Honorable Mokhali on the foreign governments in terms of costs, for now we've made a request through DERCO through an verbal for consideration of the transportation costs because they were quite steep for us to a number of governments included are those where we've been deporting to. That will include Ethiopia, Nigeria, Malawi, Zimbabwe, to a lesser extent Mozambique, because they've been paying for their nationals. Zimbabwe has been paying for their nationals. Malawi paid for some, but the bulk were really provided for by South Africa. I think
that changes the story. According to the Director General, Mozambique had been paying for its nationals. Zimbabwe had been paying for its nationals. Malawi had paid for some. And South Africa had covered the bulk. So the concept of another government contributing toward the return of its citizens did not suddenly appear with the Nigeria, Malawi and Ethiopia reimbursement letters. There was already some cost sharing happening in practice. And now the real question becomes narrower. Not, can one African country ever contribute to returning its nationals? Parliament tells us that has already happened. The real questions are, what exact costs is Pretoria seeking now? How were those costs allocated by nationality? And what agreement, understanding or diplomatic arrangement would make each government responsible for them? On the evidence we've reviewed, those questions are not yet answered by the headline figure alone. And this is where the story becomes even more unusual. Because while South Africa is seeking reimbursement for return costs, Nigeria is pursuing a completely different kind of claim against South Africa. Reuters reported in late July that Abuja was compiling compensation claims for Nigerians who suffered losses during the unrest. Nearly 1,500 Nigerians had been voluntarily evacuated by Nigeria by mid-July. Nigeria later said it was still waiting for a South African response to its compensation request. Ghana has also documented losses suffered by its citizens. Ghana's compensation effort includes claims relating to businesses, investments and property affected during the attacks. Reuters had already reported Ghana compiling lost assets for possible legal action, while subsequent reporting described a claims register for affected Ghanaians. But here's another distinction. Nigeria and Ghana are not simply sending South Africa the same R292 million invoice in reverse. These are fundamentally different claims. South Africa says, we incurred extraordinary costs returning people to their countries. Some of those governments should contribute. Nigeria and Ghana are saying, our citizens suffered losses during violence and unrest in South Africa. Those losses should be documented and compensation pursued. One is about return and repatriation costs. The other is about alleged losses suffered by individuals and businesses. Combining both into two competing $18 million invoices makes a great headline, but it doesn't accurately describe the evidence. And this is where we have to resist the temptation to manufacture a winner before the evidence exists. South Africa has established that it spent roughly R292 million. It has established that it requested reimbursement. And its Director General told Parliament that requesting countries ordinarily bear primary transport and logistics responsibility in voluntary repatriation. But that is still not the same thing as proving that Nigeria, Malawi or Ethiopia owes a specific amount. Nigeria, meanwhile, is documenting losses suffered by its citizens. Ghana is doing something similar. Those claims may become the basis of diplomatic negotiations or legal action. But documenting a loss is not the same thing as establishing that South Africa is legally liable for every rand claimed. And that is why the evidence doesn't support a simple answer to GT. Whose invoice is stronger? Because there aren't really two mirror image invoices. There are different legal, financial and diplomatic questions moving in opposite directions. Home Affairs says it requested reimbursement from Malawi, Nigeria and Ethiopia. R292 million is the reported overall expenditure figure. The parliamentary evidence we've reviewed does not allocate that whole amount separately to each country. Home Affairs explicitly says that total combines people who were repatriated with people who were deported. Mahode told Parliament that Mozambique and Zimbabwe had been paying for their nationals, and Malawi had covered some costs. They are pursuing compensation claims connected to losses suffered by their nationals. That is real. But that is not the same thing as a matching $18 million invoice. And perhaps that is the most important lesson in this story. South Africa's migration crisis is now producing costs in both directions. Pretoria wants African governments to share some of the financial burden of returning their nationals. Nigeria and Ghana want South Africa to confront the financial losses suffered by some of their citizens. Those arguments don't cancel each other out. They are asking different questions. And before Africa can answer either one, Governments will have to do something headlines cannot do. They will have to identify who was deported, who returned voluntarily, which government requested the return, what each journey actually cost, which losses can actually be proven, and what legal or diplomatic obligation attaches to each one. Until then, the clearest conclusion is this: the request is real. The 1801 bill is not that simple. This is the South Africa file. We don't stop at the claim, we check what the evidence actually says. If you value that kind of analysis, subscribe, share this investigation, and tell us in the comments, should countries share repatriation costs? And should compensation claims for losses suffered during anti-migrant violence be treated as a separate issue? That's where the real debate begins.